Friends, you're watching the Ruslan Belov channel, and this is your daily analytical battlefield briefing. Great to have you back. Those of you who follow the real picture of what's happening, rather than official dispatches and propaganda narratives from either side. Before we get into it, a big ask, one I repeat regularly and will keep repeating until things change. Please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon, selecting notifications for all new videos. YouTube is actively working against this type of content. Military analytical channels get shadow banned, their reach is artificially suppressed, and the algorithm hides these videos from wider audiences. Without your active support, subscriptions, likes, comments, and yes, the bell, the channel simply ceases to exist for new viewers. So every action you take isn't just a courtesy, it's real pushback against algorithmic censorship. A separate and sincere thank you to our sponsors, people who consciously support independent analysis at a time when it's becoming increasingly rare. And of course, a special thank you to everyone who has used the Super Thanks feature. That's real money going directly into the channel's development, equipment, maps, and the time I put into preparing every single episode. You are literally keeping this project alive, and I genuinely appreciate it. Now, let's get to work. There's plenty to discuss today. The May 9th ceasefire, what's really behind it? Let's start with the topic that's being actively debated across all circles. The Victory Day ceasefire. Official statements remain vague. Whether it will be a one-day pause or a three-day pause, as was the case last year, is still unclear. But last year's precedent is quite telling and deserves a closer look. In 2024, the Russian army, by the admission of Ukrainian military analysts themselves, used the three-day pause with undisguised tactical advantage. While the ceasefire held, Russian units repositioned forces and resources to the areas they needed, without the risk of being hit while in transit. They regrouped and then launched into May with one of the strongest monthly performances of the entire active phase of the conflict. Over 500 square kilometers brought under control in a single month. That's not propaganda. Those are figures recorded by independent mappers on both sides of the conflict. The question for this year is therefore straightforward. Will history repeat itself? The Ukrainian side, judging by all available signals, understands this risk perfectly well. It's expected that in the lead-up to May 9th and during any ceasefire window, AFU, Armed Forces of Ukraine, formations will launch hundreds of drones, a demonstration that any pause will be exploited as aggressively as possible. It's psychological pressure and propaganda rolled into one. But the facts from the front suggest that the initiative, as before, does not rest with the Ukrainian side. Let's open the map. Sumy Oblast. Northern Group rewrites expectations. This is the headline story of today's briefing, and it genuinely is remarkable. I'll be straight with you. When I gave my forecasts for the Sumy direction a few days ago, in the April wrap-up episode, I was deliberately cautious. My assessment was this. Northern Group is unlikely to replicate its April pace in Sumy Oblast. The bar is too high, the terrain too complex, the resistance too stiff. A realistic May forecast was around 30 square kilometers, 40 at a real stretch. That would already have been an excellent result. Today is May 3rd. Northern Group has already hit that number. Let that sink in. 3 days into May, and the monthly forecast is already done. Either my projection was far too conservative, or Northern Group is currently operating in conditions that have aligned exceptionally favorably, and they are making full use of every one of them. The central event, the capture of Myropoli and the large-scale clearing of surrounding territory. Let's break this down in detail, because the scale here genuinely matters. Myropoli is not some minor hamlet you'd skim past in a briefing. Before the war, around 3,000 people lived here. The settlement stretches roughly 6 kilometers across. It's a fully fledged strongpoint with substantial built-up area. Hundreds of residential properties, streets, infrastructure. For advancing units, this means cover, the ability to mass forces, and the possibility of organizing logistical hubs. In short, everything needed to sustain forward momentum. Taking Myropoli is not a tactical footnote. It is an operational foothold. But the capture of the settlement itself is only part of the picture. Simultaneously, Russian units cleared the territory between the state border with Kursk Oblast and Myropolye. a strip roughly 3 kilometers deep and more than 4 kilometers wide. This is a buffer zone that eliminates the direct threat of a flanking strike from the north and makes Miropoli itself considerably more stable in operational terms. Additionally, the area between Miropoli and Miropilske was cleared. The depth of advance varies. Closer to Miropoli, roughly 3.5 kilometers from the border. Closer to Miropilske, around 1 kilometer. 1 kilometer may sound modest, but 1 kilometer of control beats zero, especially when it closes off a flank. Now the most striking figure, the total width of the advance front was 16 kilometers. 16, in a single 24-hour period. I've been running these briefings long enough to say, I don't recall anything like it. A simultaneous advance across such a wide frontage isn't a local tactical success. It's a sign of either a systemic collapse of AFU defenses on this axis, or an exceptionally well-timed and well-directed strike. Most likely, both at once. Total territory brought under control in the Miropoli zone over the past 24 hours, 39.5 square kilometers. Stack that on top of what was already taken earlier in May, and it becomes clear Northern Group hasn't just met the May forecast, it has rendered that forecast obsolete and opened an entirely different horizon of possibilities. Strategic outlook, the threat to Sumy and the 2027 horizon. Let's now step back and look at the strategic picture, because that's where the most interesting analysis lies. Look at the map. 3 vectors of pressure on Sumy are converging simultaneously. The first, from the north. Russian units continue a slow but steady advance directly towards Sumy. The pace remains measured, but the trend is consistent. A few more settlements stand between the current positions and the Sumy forest. And that forest, as experience has shown, is precisely the kind of terrain where Russian infantry performs best. Drones lose much of their effectiveness under tree cover, and numerical superiority in infantry starts to become the decisive factor. The second, from the east, pressure on the Sumy axis has also been recorded from the direction of Taratutyne and Novodmitrivka. Another vector, another threat that AFU must find resources to counter. The third, and now from the west, via Miropolye. Look at the map carefully. From Miropolye, a road runs directly towards Sumy. The route is straightforward: Miropolye, river crossing, Zapsilia, Velika Rybitsia, and then you're at Velika Chernetchina, which already sits on the approaches to the city itself. Between the now captured Miropolye and the outskirts of Sumy, there are literally a handful of settlements. This does not mean Russian forces will appear on the city's edge tomorrow or the day after. That's not the scenario on the table. But it does mean that the foundation for such a scenario now exists. One bridgehead, then a second, then a third, and all of them oriented toward the same point. My personal analytical read: this may not be a final push, but the laying of foundations. Foundations for 2027. The war clearly isn't ending this year, and likely not next year either. By 2027, if the current trajectory holds, conditions may mature for Sumy itself to become an explicit operational objective. For now, it's pressure, accumulation, probing the defense. For AFU command, the situation is, to put it plainly, uncomfortable. Over the past 30 days, more than 100 square kilometers of territory have been lost in Sumy Oblast alone. The highest losses on any single sector of the front over a comparable period. General Sursky and his staff are now confronted with a problem that has no obvious solution. Where do you send reserves when pressure is coming from 3 directions at once? Kostyantynivka, a familiar pattern. Before moving on to other frontline developments, a few words on Kostyantynivka. The situation there is evolving according to a playbook we've seen before, and it's very recognizable. Dozens of destroyed vehicles along the approach roads to Kostyantynivka. These are not random combat losses, this is the systematic destruction of logistics. For context, this is precisely the pattern that preceded the collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Kursk Oblast. First, total destruction of equipment on supply routes. Then the impossibility of rotation, of resupplying ammunition, food and replacements. Then, a rapid and effectively uncontrolled collapse. In Kostyantynivka, logistics are now essentially paralyzed. If AFU cannot find a way to restore supply lines, and doing so under constant strikes is extremely difficult. Then the time horizon to a critical deterioration of the situation here may be measured in weeks rather than months. That said, war has a habit of surprising everyone. We'll see. Dobropia. Direction: the western flank holds back the tempo. West of the settlement of Hryshine, an advance by Russian units has been recorded. It's a potentially advantageous axis. Under the right conditions, it opens a path northward toward Dobropia. However, there is a fundamental constraint. Before any northward movement can be undertaken, the western flank must be secured, and that means taking Vasilivka and Mern. Both settlements currently remain under AFU control. Until that task is completed, advancing north would be a tactically unjustifiable risk. An open flank in modern warfare is an open invitation to a counterstrike. Command understands this, which is why northward movement on this sector is not something to expect in the coming days. Flanks first, then the advance. Daily summary, figures and facts. For the past 24 hours, one settlement and 40.3 square kilometers of territory came under Russian control. Virtually the entire result belongs to Northern Group in Sumy Oblast. By any measure, it was an objectively very strong day. Strikes on infrastructure. Kryvyi Rih, Kharkiv, Ternopil. The Russian army continues its methodical targeting of Ukrainian rail infrastructure. This time, a locomotive in the Kryvyi Rih area of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast was struck by a Geran attack drone. This is far from the first such incident. The deliberate targeting of traction stock is an attack on Ukraine's ability to move equipment and personnel by rail. In other words, on its strategic mobility. In Kharkiv, fuel stations came under fire for the second consecutive day. Local authorities report 9 targeted sites over 2 days. According to Ukrainian sources, AI-equipped drones were used, with strikes recorded in the Osnovansky, Saltivsky, and Kolodnohersky districts of the city. The most significant story, however, is unfolding in Ternopil. By Ukrainian accounts, this was the most powerful drone strike on the city and its surroundings since the beginning of the conflict. A fire at an industrial facility ignited 2 days ago was only extinguished today. It burned for over 24 hours. The targets were the Ternopil mechanical plant and its associated infrastructure, along with a reinforced concrete structures facility. These were not random selections. The mechanical plant, according to available data, had been used to host repair and restoration capacity for military equipment, as well as UAV production, and this had been successfully re-established despite previous strikes, including a major attack in 2023. As for the concrete structures plant, a significant portion of its output was directed to the front line for the construction of fortifications. In other words, striking both facilities simultaneously hits production, repair, and defensive construction in one operation. Geopolitics, the fracturing of the Western Bloc. Now to the geopolitical segment, and here the picture is no less interesting than what we've seen on the front lines. The fracturing of the collective West, which had been building for years, has, with the arrival of the Trump administration, transformed from an analytical abstraction into tangible political reality. Nothing quite like this has happened since the formation of the unified Western Bloc after 1945. That is not hyperbole. It is a structurally significant development. Historically, the West operated on a clear hierarchical model. The United States as uncontested leader setting strategic direction. The United Kingdom and France as senior allies with some tactical autonomy. West Germany, Japan, South Korea as junior partners operating within Washington's framework. It was a stable architecture. That architecture is now cracking. American leadership has ceased to be axiomatic, and a sequence of compounding foreign policy failures has driven that process. The first, the Trump administration's inability to compel European allies to accept the American template for resolving the Ukraine conflict. It appears that certain understandings were reached during Russian-American talks in Alaska, but Europe successfully torpedoed them. The EU and the United Kingdom are pursuing an independent line on Ukraine, and doing so openly, without masking that independence. The second, the Greenland episode. American claims to the Danish Arctic territory met with an unexpectedly firm response from the European Union. Brussels signaled its readiness for a direct confrontation with Washington if force were employed. That was a qualitatively new signal. Europeans no longer fear American pressure as they once did. The third, the failure in the Middle East. The war with Iran did not deliver Washington a convincing victory, and that failure appears to have been the event that finally convinced European bureaucrats that Trump and his team are not an irresistible force. The tactical success in Venezuela did nothing to change that impression. Today, the Western world has effectively split into two competing centers. The first, the United States and its Indo-Pacific partners, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, Taiwan. Their cohesion is pragmatic rather than ideological. All of them need America as a counterweight to China. The second, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Formerly still American allies, but in practice an alternative center of gravity within the Western world, running their own play. This is no longer a tactical disagreement, it is a strategic divergence. Iran, the Strait of Hormuz blockade and its consequences. The IRGC has stated that war with the United States will likely resume. Tehran is explicit. Every time Iran softened its demands, the American side hardened its position. By Iranian command's assessment, Washington has honored none of the commitments made. In diplomatic language, that means the negotiating track is exhausted. The consequences of the Strait of Hormuz blockade are becoming increasingly tangible for the global economy. Traffic through the strait has fallen by 90% from pre-war levels. Fewer than 10 vessels now pass through daily. This is, for practical purposes, a complete halt to oil transit. Exxon's CEO told shareholders bluntly, if the strait remains closed, the consequences for global energy markets will be dramatically worse than what we're seeing now. Initially, the supply shortfall was offset by tankers already at sea and US strategic reserves being released onto the market. That buffer is now gone. According to the US Energy Information Administration, gasoline inventories have fallen to their lowest level for this time of year in over a decade, 222 million barrels. For the world's largest economy, that is critically thin. One of the first casualties of the energy crisis may be American airline Spirit Airlines, which has announced it is preparing to cease operations. The primary cause cited, a sharp rise in jet fuel costs driven by the Middle Eastern conflict. A request for $500 million in government financial support was not granted. Meanwhile, Trump is already looking ahead. According to his own statements, once the Iranian campaign is concluded, the fleet could be redirected toward Cuba. The president sketched the scenario in his characteristic style. The aircraft carrier Lincoln, the biggest in the world, pulls up to within roughly 100 yards of the shore, whereupon Cuba surrenders. He also commented on the seizure of Iranian vessels during the naval blockade with notable candor. We're like pirates, adding that it's a very profitable business. Europe, troop withdrawals, trade war, and the debt spiral. Trump has moved forward with a partial reduction of America's military footprint in Europe, specifically the withdrawal of one army brigade of approximately 5,000 personnel. A more significant drawdown is off the table for now due to budget constraints. Current legislation requires maintaining a minimum of 76,000 troops in theater. Nonetheless, even pulling one brigade returns the American presence in Europe to pre-war levels, and that carries real symbolic weight. In parallel, the trade confrontation is heating up. Trump has threatened to raise tariffs on European automobiles from 15% to 25%. Brussels is examining its options for retaliation. Among the measures under consideration, selling American government bonds. For the United States, this would be a painful blow, having already lost the Gulf monarchies as major holders of US debt. The loss of another class of treasury buyers would be a serious stress test for the financial system. The debt crisis will deepen, and in that context, European threats read not as a bluff, but as a genuinely credible instrument of leverage. That's all for today's briefing. The situation is moving fast, particularly on the Sumy axis, where the pace of events has already outrun the most optimistic forecasts. Stay tuned, don't miss the next episode, and remember, subscribing and hitting the bell at a time when this kind of content faces active algorithmic suppression is real support that genuinely matters. See you on air.